first webinar. We're delighted to be partnered with the team at Interact today to discuss the practical steps that you can take to develop a sustainability strategy for your data centre. Now, we'd kindly ask you to just listen and learn just whilst we run through our slides. And if you want to post any questions into the chat, so you should see the chat button on the right-hand side, and then we'll come back to them at the end. We'll have a sort of 5-10 minute Q&A session, of which we'll answer any questions that you might have. So whilst we're going through, if you've got any questions, post them in there. We'll come back to them at the end. Great, so let's get started then. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Chloe. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Welcome, everybody. So Chris West from KeySource. I head up our managed services, and I've been with our business over 20 years, working in the data center industry.
Hi everyone, Steve Lorimer, Technical Director at KeySource Group. I've been with KeySource for getting on 20 years now in various technical roles across the business, worked in lots of data centers, lots of different sizes. And as you can see today, very passionate about the topic of sustainability in data centers.
Hi, my name's Rich. I'm the Managing Director at Interact, which is our machine learning SaaS focused business on energy efficiency and IT specifically. So excited to talk to you about that.
Great, thank you. Shall I move us on?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the big part of PUE that is often overlooked and the practical steps to a sustainable data center. So we're going to cover a couple of topics here. Around PUE and how we believe that is something that we've been using for a long time and everyone is super used to, but we want to question whether we believe that's the thing of the future, and is PUE going to be a sustainable metric going forwards? Well, so PUE, it's the bedrock of everything, right? Since 2007, it's all been about PUE. You know, I've been in the industry for quite some time, and we've used it as the control point, you know, in building data centers, designing data centers, and operating data centers. It's been our control point to measure against as the industry's exploded, and for me, it's helped us drive and challenge ourselves to design and operate efficient M&E. But Steve, I'm not sure that the green grid really anticipated it would be used in quite the way we've used it. Is that fair?
I think, you know, when we originally set out, and when the green grid originally set out to develop a metric to help us to improve energy efficiency of our facilities, you know, I don't think could ever have envisaged that it would be used so widely, but that wide use, I think for anyone that's been around for a few years in the data center industry now saw that it turned almost into misuse to a certain extent. You know, data center operators seized on it, you know, to try and demonstrate a competitive differentiator above and beyond the other operators out in the market. You know, they were using it. It was used to compare facilities that were in different geographical locations, and you know, potentially, and even facilities that serve different purposes have different levels of resilience, different levels of fixed losses. So, you know, it was really originally intended to you know, to aid us in the optimization of a single facility. And you know what, where that's used appropriately, you know, it's helped operators enormously and enabled operators enormously to, you know, to measure the impact that the changes that they've made have had on the overall energy consumption. But I guess that's only really part of the story, and that's to a certain extent, you know, you're going to hear later on from some of the rest of the team where we need to improve on that.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. The Green Grid even submitted a paper in 2014 I'm trying to clarify how we would use PUE, but I think it's absolutely the key point there is that it was intended to be used to measure the improvements of a single facility, not to be an industry-wide metric to look at each other and how our PUEs may differ, as Steve says, different use, different geographies, different technologies. You know, and since 2007, yes, we've been looking at PUE, and for the most part, organizations are still looking at power-related sustainability metrics. You know, so 82% of us are tracking power consumption, 70% of us are tracking PUE, but you know, going forwards, far too few of us are tracking some of the other key elements, and this is from the 2021 Uptime Institute industry report. And Rich, to bring you in here, I noticed down here we've got only 40% of us are tracking server utilization. I guess you're probably a bit stunned about that, are you?
Right.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
People tend to not actually look at the IT a whole lot. They
So,
look at the building,
good morning, everyone, and
like
thank you
PUE
so
and
much for
M&E
joining us on
to make incremental changes, but they very rarely look at why the building's there in the first place, and that's for the housing, the IT. So that comes down to decision making around what to buy, how to use it, and part of that how to use it is the utilization stats. So, you know, we've done analysis on hundreds of data centers now. Utilization rarely exceeds 30 to 40%. So what we see is a lot of over provisioning, a lot of incomplete data on how effective their systems are, and we then focus on cooling inefficient IT. And one of those inefficiencies, just one of the IT inefficiencies, is utilization. You know, servers, based on the configurations and how they're built, they perform better or worse at different utilization levels, and people rarely look at that. They just, you know, set it running at 5 to 10%, it works its way up to 20%, and then they replace it. And that aspect of it, that server utilization, is a crucial part in how you create a sustainable and effective data center.
Yeah, when you're looking, you know, when you're talking about a PUE of 1.1, you know, by that very metric, you know how much of that is the IT. So, you know, when we talk about the big part of PUE that's often overlooked, that's what, you know, we're talking about IT here.
Yeah, we're talking about what we're cooling in the first place, I suppose. Like what is PUE a metric of? Fundamentally, is how effective it is at cooling that equipment. But, you know, the very nature of looking at that equipment could make our PUE go up. As we get more efficient as a data center, we could actually get worse in PUE, but it would be a positive. Yeah. Which just, I think, leave people with their hands tied a little bit sometimes, I think.
Absolutely. A good PUE doesn't mean you've got efficient IT, right? So, you know, so you know, hang on a minute. So what are we saying from the outset here? Are we saying that PUE is the way forward? Well, let's go on to look at that. And you know, our belief is that PUE alone isn't a metric for sustainability. In fact, according to the same industry report that the Uptime Institute have done just recently, only 38% of us believe that what we're doing, you know, is curbing data center energy use or water use or emissions. So if we're considering our global drive to sustainability, the question should be put out there that is PUE still relevant? Well, I think it is, but there's a bunch of other things that we need to consider here, you know, when we're talking about sustainability. But, you know, the most dramatic increases in energy efficiencies were achieved between 2007 and 2013. But Steve, you know, a lot of those quick wins are still out there, right? You know, particularly in the M&E, they're still there to be had, right?
I think you know, Chris, we still see a significant number of legacy facilities out there that are, you know, sweating assets and are maybe constrained and not able to, for various reasons, make changes to the infrastructure and the ways in which they're configured. We still see poor performing facilities, and so let's not forget that. So there are still opportunities, and yes, it's still a relevant metric for use within single facilities to manage the energy efficiency of the M&E layer, but that's part of the story. You know, we have to consider how we deal with equipment replacements and life cycle replacements of critical M&E infrastructure that in some cases were installed a significant period of time ago. You know, we can continue with those good design practices that we've put in place, but you know, that needs to evolve alongside the changing architecture of the equipment that we're hosting within those facilities as well. You know, we're not standing still as an industry. You know, if we look at technologies like direct liquid cooling, you know, if we're going to optimize the energy efficiency around those systems, then we need to consider how they best integrate with the environment from a heat rejection point of view, and you know, that has to form part of those life cycle considerations. But you know what, as we see later, and as I've alluded to, you know, that's only one of the factors. You know, we're not considering elements such as carbon that PUE can't ever report on. You know, we're not looking at the waste impact, we're not looking at the reuse, we're not looking at the water, and you know, sustainability is so much more than just energy and carbon. We're not looking at the social considerations here, and you know what, there are a lot of facilities out there with poor PUEs, and that could be with investment or governments or governance issues that don't permit you know, the changes in the space. But you know, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to consider these wider items. And you know what? If you look at carbon, for example, whilst we've made energy improvements within the data center, actually most of the improvements that we've seen in this country since 2012 are due to the grid and the shift that we've seen towards renewables there.
And I think. Yeah, and I think, Steve, the point here is that in that statement, you know, 75% of the reductions since 2012, and that's testament to us in terms of what we did and the opportunity that we had. But it also indicates that we've sort of gone as far as we can to a certain extent with the M&E. And I think this is, you know, where Rich is probably pretty passionate insofar as he's like, why are you putting all this effort into these marginal gains now when you're not looking you know, this big part of PUE that no one talks about, and you know, Rich, I want to hear from you in a little bit around what you think about and what you're doing to practically help people address that side of the PUE. You know, whether we believe PUE is sustainable, it absolutely is here to stay for a little while. It's just we have to build around it, and I think now's a good point to just reflect perhaps on, you know, what we have done in the past around design, how we've deployed and operate IT hardware, and how we've put those facilities into operation, and what the influencing factors are. You know, what have we done, and what were the legacy approaches, and how sustainable and responsible and efficient we thought they were, and you know, what are we doing right now? But crucially, you know, what do we need to be doing going forward? And it can't just be PUE. You know, we should talk about PUE, but we have to build upon that. You know, just to recap, in terms of, you know, 20 years in the industry, there's a bunch of people on the call who we know have been in the industry a long time. We'll remember, and I did, you know, 10 years ago, probably less than that, you know, when we were designing a data center, we have to hold our hands up to say that, you know, the first things on the sheet of paper was, how big does it need to be? How much resilience is it going to have? How scalable can it be? You know, what sort of loads are we going to need to provision here? And, you know, those fundamental starting points have resulted in massive over provisioning and particularly stranded capacity, as we consider that actually a lot of the resilience in operations has moved from within the physical infrastructure actually into the IT layer, with this ability to move compute dynamically. You know, I challenged that we needed all of that back then. Well, we did need it back then because the technology wasn't there in the compute. But, you know, we need to look back not only when we design data centers and facilities now, but also as we go through life cycle, to consider if those were the right decisions then, and address them going forwards. You know, and there were, I talk about the explosion of the industry, there was a massive response to building facilities, whether that was on the operator side or owner operator side, it doesn't matter. But, you know, there was a massive, we've got to build quick and get it going. And there was an element there where people were putting in low capital, high TCO installations, particularly if you take cooling, for example, not leveraging free cooling at the time just to get the equipment stood up and going from a low capital point of view. And, you know, we should look back on that and reflect. You know, at the same time, we were absolutely, there were parts of the industry that were striving to be super efficient in those areas. You know, and across the IT hardware layer, you know, what we have done is we've definitely looked at virtualization, consolidation of legacy systems. We deploy clusters, blades, you know, and that has helped for sure. You know, and in ongoing operations, we've elevated supply temperatures. We've looked at control points, you know, is it return or supply air? How can we improve that? And for sure, what we have done is we've got much better, you know, in the context of PUE, we've got much better at being able to understand what our PUE is down to a granular level. So understanding what are the subcomponents of the facility that impact that and where the inefficiencies lie. And that has been due to, or the ability to understand that has been due to metering that we've put in, and energy management systems and BMS and EMS and PMS and all the systems that, you know, you'll know and love. But we must keep doing that. We must keep doing that, and we must keep developing our baseline metrics and our, you know, tracking KPIs. Got to keep doing that, because Steve, that's the start of the journey, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, you noted there, Chris, that a lot of the decisions and the considerations around the facilities historically have you know, have related to commercial incentives and lower operating costs. And you know, it's only more recently that people start looking at other elements such as, you know, carbon, and but then we're still limiting to a certain extent that to scope 1 and 2, you know, our direct or indirect emissions, you know, relating to the facilities themselves and, you know, the energy which they consume. You know, it's really important moving forward, you know, for us to for the reasons that everyone's aware of, for you know, the goals that to meet the goals that have been set out by the UN, to you know, from an environmental and a social and a governance perspective, that we continue to do the good work that we've done to date, but moving to, you know, that what a future data center needs to look like is going to require an even bigger step forward to, you know, consider alongside the commercial incentives other elements. You know, we need to carry on following best practice. You know, we need to continue to undertake the best practice and meet standards and guidance out there, but we're going to need a wholesale change and approach to data centers to hit the net zero.
Yeah, and I want to dive into that with you in a moment, if that's okay. And you're into what we're doing now, you know, scope 1 and scope 2. You know, I look back on high efficient cooling that was deployed, you know, up until quite recently, heavily water dependent as capacity components at times, and some of the gains that we got with that, but also some of the limitations. But we never considered the limitation of or not the limitation, but the sustainability element of using all of this water. It was just, we did it because it was cheap and it offered a sufficient operation. But actually, you know, that wasn't where the focus should have been. And so what we're doing now is we're looking more about reusing, you know, fuels and resources. You know, we're also looking at where we put facilities. Yes, of course, that's because in some areas it's cheaper to do it, and there are some areas where it's right to do it, of course. And of course, we're also looking at things like efficient low load M&E, which I think is super important. We didn't do that back then. We would, you know, we were designing for maximum load, and it became a problem when customers and users didn't put the full capacity in their day one. So moving on a bit in terms of IT hardware, we're definitely seeing this at the moment. You know, you go to any of the trade shows, industry events, you've got immersive direct chip cooling IT out there. And as Rich has alluded to and is going to go on to talk about, you know, it's commonplace for continual replacement of what people consider to be better technology or greater compute capacity, although I think Rich has got a view on that, which we're going to cover shortly. You know, from an operational point of view, we're doing more in recycling, you know, not just in, you know, the core operation of the facility, but everything that happens around it. So we are doing more, but that's probably because we've got greater influencing factors and SCCR and stuff like that, Steve, you're going to talk about in a bit. But I want to focus more on the what we should be doing. And Steve, I wonder if you could take us into what you think from a facility design it needs to look like for us, and some of the things that we should be looking into.
So after two years of lockdown, you would have thought I'd learned to unmute by now, but there we go. Okay, so do you know, I just want to take a little step back. You know, what is sustainability in a data center, and you know, what does a next generation data center need to have, you know, to have sustainability at its core, not just for when it's built, but for the whole life cycle. You know, you know, it needs to, you know, it's got to achieve, you know, ultimately what the 17 UN Sustainability Development Goals are. It's got to have those at its core, but not just from a carbon point of view. You know, it has to also consider the social and environmental impacts that facility has in its operation, but also on the people that make it, where the energy comes from, and you know, the people that use it as well. You know, so in order to do that, we're going to have to address, you know, the renewable energy. You know, we need to be using renewable energy all of the time. That's 24/7. It's got to have a net zero carbon footprint. It's got to have net zero waste, and it's got to have net zero emissions as well. And you know, we're a long way off that at the moment. We're a long way off achieving all of those items. But you know, I think we're making good progress to a certain extent. You know, but also it's still got to deliver the goals, both commercially and technically, that the facility has set out to do. So, you know, if we're addressing the renewable energy, you know, we're pretty good at PUE, but you know, we're going to have to keep on doing that. And you know, Rich will talk a little bit more shortly about what we can do on the server side. But from a renewable energy point of view, we're going to have to look at different ways. You know, we're going to have to remove that power source, move that power source as close to the facility as we can as a priority. And you know, secondary, any additional power, it should be that should come from outside the facility. You know, we need to get that renewable energy source as close to the facilities as possible. And when it comes to embodied carbon, you know, I think, you know, it's really important to consider that this covers a number of elements, not just the construction of the facility. You know, actually, that's a relatively small amount of carbon compared to the operational life cycle of the facility, when you consider the number of changes that we have to MEP and IT. You know, today, you know, I go back to it again, the decisions around infrastructure and products that we've used within the facility have at best been based on a return investment on an energy proposition. You know, they've not considered necessarily the sourcing of the components, the carbon within those components, or the ethical, social sourcing of the components and materials there. You know, and from a carbon point of view, it's really important, because the carbon within those the ongoing elements like the MEP and the IT can be as much as 3 times the construction of the facility, and the energy, because we're using a renewable source from a carbon perspective is significantly less than those over the whole life cycle of the facility, especially if it's net zero moving forward, and that makes using tools like some of the traditional assessments of LEED and BREEAM, whilst they're still relevant to an extent, that they're limited in their applicability when you consider that moving forward. So we need to look at, if we look at the construction of the facility, we need to look at the materials that we're using there. We all know steel, there are techniques in steel manufacturing now and moving forward that will ultimately lower the carbon as part of that, that's emitted as part of that process. And we know that there are techniques and methods with respect to cement and concrete that aren't necessarily new, but can also lower the carbon as part of that. We will have to start looking at different techniques. And how do we do that? Well, thanks for moving over to the next slide, Chris. There's several ways in which we do that, but only part of that challenge relates to that product itself. We at the moment we see manufacturers starting to look at the availability of environmental product declarations as part of their systems, but and their offerings. I think most people are aware that whilst we have a lot out there, the key components that go into data centers, that they're not all covered, and we're going to need that information moving forward. Part of this challenge is going to be about how we address the measurement and managing the whole life cycle carbon reductions, and we're going to have to do that through assessment initially. When we do the design, but we're going to have to do that as part of the ongoing operation. And if you look at some of the best practices out there at the moment that we've all been using for a number of years, and some better than others, some using it as a tick box in a marketing, like the European Code of Conduct, they're now mandating, from 2022 moving forward, that life cycle assessments need to be part of your submissions or you have to say that you're doing as part of your submissions for the EU Code of Conduct. That's really important. And emissions and waste, and I think this is again about, we talked about location earlier of data centers. We're going to have to be challenging ourselves more on where we're locating the facilities, or perhaps who we're locating these facilities close to. We need to think about how we're going to perhaps reuse the wastes that today people have said are only useful really if we've got a greenhouse close by, or a swimming pool close by. We're going to need to look at those opportunities. Do edge data centers lend themselves better to be located in newer residential developments where we can perhaps use the waste heat? Can we look at industries which work holistically alongside data centers? Are we going to become not less of a consumer of energy, but also an energy supplier to some of our neighbors? And I think that's all part of our challenge. And as an organisation, we're looking, and we'll talk about this in a bit more in a moment. We're looking at our products and service lines and aligning those with those requirements. And that's because our customers and the users of the space, and to a certain extent, the people that are investing in those facilities, require that. And to a certain extent, people have been asking for that more recently, but I'm not entirely convinced that all of those items, if we look about into the ethical sourcing, has the whole life cycle been considered? We're going to see it as a greater requirement for us to meet the standards required to get permits and planning permissions. We're going to be called more and more, in the same way that we are with respect to SECR and ESOS to a certain extent as well, to to provide these statutory compliance reports. We're going to have to provide those, and that's going to be a legal requirement, and that's going to drive net zero. And again, this is all about addressing the climate emergency, but also our responsibility and our social, the social aspects of what we do as an industry.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And for me, the takeaway here is the drive has to be not only to consider the impact of facilities in operation, but also the impact of the supply chain we use to deploy them and the materials that we use to construct them. And a lot of the work that you've been doing recently has been looking, what we're starting to call whole life and embodied carbon. It's not just about how you operate; it's about what you do to build it and how you build it. And I think, this is interesting because the topic of the webinar here is PUE, but I think it's crucial that we understand that PUE is relevant and will remain relevant, but it's not just that; it's not the only part. But there are still, and thanks, Steve, for that. But I think, going back to PUE for a moment, there's still massive gains that we can do. And, for me, something I'm hugely passionate about is DCIM and how customers deploy tooling to understand the IT hardware that's out there, where it is, and its age and what it does and who owns it and all that good stuff. And having been deploying DCIM for 15 years or so, I always look at these tools and I think, now we've got this visibility of this estate, surely there's something that we can be doing about it. And Rich, I'm really keen for you to tell us how you see this big part of PUE and how you see we can start addressing this inefficiency that's out there and this big bit that we don't talk about.
Yeah, I think, on a slight change of tact, I'm always going to talk about IT. That's my background. Like, servers is where I'm strong, so I play where I'm strong. But in the data center area, 65% of our energy is in the IT. So we look at things like PUE, we look at the buildings, and on PUE, we're looking at how we're more effective at not wasting excess energy to provide the cooling for, that 65%. For me, I'd say flip it, look at that 65% first. How do we reduce that 65% to the lowest possible level it can do? And we have specific tools in place for that, and we analyze that. I also want to say that we talk about sustainability, and in the data center industry, it always comes out as carbon. Like, we talk about sustainability and people go, yeah, reduce carbon. You go, yeah, wicked. But they're nearly always talking about how do they save money on energy. And when we're talking sustainability, even if we want to talk embodied carbon costs around scope 3, so the embodied cost of creating the assets, there's around about a ton of scope 3 carbon in the creation of a server. And you go, well, that's loads. That's an awful lot. And for every server that gets recycled or reused or just destroyed, you never recover that, because that's the creation cost through mining, through extraction. But within every server as well is 23 of the world's 30 most critical raw materials. So that's, tantalum, cobalt, gold, neodymium, antimony. Like, these are critical raw materials in severe short supply that have an incredible social impact to remove. We talk about ESG, and I hate the term ESG. Environmental social governance. And when ExxonMobil can be the world's best ESG rated business in the world, your job is literally pulling dead animals out of the world, and putting them into cars. That's primarily your purpose. That can't be an environmentally focused top performer in my mind, regardless of how they want to offset that or deal with that. So it's a metric that in and of itself is flawed, a bit like PUE is. It's a good start. It's a good thing. It should not be what we talk about. We should be talking about full life cycle, as in from start to end, and we should be talking about the impact of all our assets. And in this case, with servers, we're talking about massive raw material usage, huge carbon usage, and massive waste. Now, why this is so pertinent right now is because in around about 2014, we unequivocally disproved Moore's law. So Moore's law is a fundamental law of computing around CPU architecture that says they halve in size or double in performance every 2 years. And in 2014, that just stopped happening. We got incremental changes, not transformational changes. What that meant was that traditional dogma of refreshing every 2 to 3 years to make huge strides in energy, that's not real anymore. It's just not real. What we're getting is these incremental changes of 13%, 15%, 18% better performance, but the efficiency that goes with that. But the embodied cost of these assets means that you probably never actually save, and just in carbon, you never probably actually save the carbon of their creation over their life cycle based on the incremental change. So you use tools, you use stuff like we've built with Interact, and we've worked with hundreds of DCs, but just in the last year we've done 130 data centers, and the savings just from optimizing the IT, and I'll tell you how we do that in a minute, around about 60% carbon and energy, 65% operational costs. So by focusing on the IT, the data center industry can significantly reduce operational running costs, while at the same time completely eradicating massive amounts of waste on energy. And we talk about that through configuration. So configuration, when I'm talking about it, this is hardware configuration. So this is the interplay between the components. This is CPU, RAM, storage, controllers. That's what I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about what licensing and what software configurations we've got. We're talking about the hardware. And what we found over the last sort of 3 years of research, and we've done a lot of this, a lot of benchmarking. We have the largest data set in the world when it comes to server-based information on metrics like performance, energy efficiency. We have 10 times the amount of data that the largest OEMs have on their own products, just as an example. That data set allows you to look in very granular detail about the impact of configuration. And what we know is configuration is king. So configuration is more important than the generation, the type, the brand, any aspect of the server. The configuration is where it starts. So understanding that is crucial, and you need to be able to analyze that in your own DC. And nobody does this. A few businesses now do it, but they don't. And the reason you analyze that is because you can look, when you have those metrics, at the cost and carbon impact of a refresh versus something like product life extension. So I've got a graph on the right here, and this isn't by any means the largest cost savings we've made for a company or anything like that. It's just a really good example of what component level upgrades can do for a business. So on that right-hand side, we've got a business, their current running costs over 4 years are about £825,000. They're running, say, 370 servers of a certain generation. By changing the configuration of those servers, playing a little bit with the utilization, they can go from 370 servers to about 60. I think it was actually 56. And the cost to buy those components to make those upgrades was around about £45,000. So what you're talking about is a massive cost saving that comes from the energy. So we're talking about reducing their energy, in this case, by 85% to do the same level of work with their same hardware that they've got. So this isn't a full decommissioning job, taking everything out, replacing with brand new, which is what the traditional metric is. This is saying, well, actually, the kit you've got is pretty good, but it's not really configured very well. Change those configurations, adjust how you're moving your workloads, and we can reduce your energy by 85%. And it's going to cost you £45,000 to do it, but over the next 5 years, you're going to save £650,000. So that cost and return on investment is significant. And that is the decision making we need to be making to look at the efficiency, the performance, and the carbon impact of our IT. So this is on a very small scale. We work with customers that have 27,000 servers in some of their data centers, and they can all make these improvements by looking at their IT closer. Even the latest generation, optimizing the IT, will have 20 and 30% benefits to the customer based on what they potentially have bought from a vendor, just by looking at the interplay between these components, how they measure RAM versus cores versus the storage, how they look at positioning geographically and what temperatures they're applying to it. There's so much that impacts in a data center as a system of systems, and the IT is a massive one. And yet we'd still just be focusing on PUE, still looking at how do we make it more effective to cool these 370 servers when we only need 60 of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rich. And I read an article not a few days ago which suggests that the data center industry was going to consume 1/5 of the global energy by 2025. So whether you believe that or not, it's still a very high number. And when you in the context of PUE, when you're looking at your 1.1s and sub that, and the one being the IT, then the opportunity here is absolutely huge, isn't it? And
absolutely vast.
And I think that was thanks, Rich, so much. And I think that we've talked about PUE and we've talked about sustainability in one, and it should be discussed in the same breath. But we can't just talk about PUE. We have to talk about sustainability, and we have to talk about sustainability when we're talking about facility design. Rich has given us some really good pointers there on how we can address, when our focus is back on PUE, how we can address that, but also the sustainability element of what we can do with our hardware. I mean, for me, that's a massive point about how can we reduce and get away from this 2-year replace, throw away when we consider kids down mines and deforestation and stuff like that. It's, you know, it's absolutely key. And PUE, you'll never get near being able to tell us, you know, our social impact. So
yeah.
we've got to move to getting the right metrics and you know, and standardized KPIs. And just a point for me, I think on the operations piece, I mean, nearly 90% of data center suppliers, operators believe AI will improve data center operational efficiency and availability in the next 5 years. So, you know, when we're talking about operations, we need to talk about software. We need to continue to push deploying energy management metering and then extending that to utility and fuel monitoring, etc. So operationally, there's still a lot that we need to do. And of course, we're going to get hammered by additional governance going forwards. And Steve, it's true to say that, you know, when we talk about, you know, kids working in mines in the DRC or deforestation in Chile and stuff like that, you know, investors are not going near projects or anything like that, you know, so there's an impact there as well. For, you know, before things get off the ground, investors aren't going there, are they? And you know, we need to consider all of that as well. So I suppose for me, you know, Rich, that's hugely important. You know, we've talked a lot about environment, we've talked a lot about energy, but we must consider the social elements of
and I think sometimes
what we're doing.
I think sometimes we don't look at the social elements because they're hard to quantify. So exactly what you're talking there, when we talk about mineral extraction, like we have done there, we've talked about, you know, you're saying kids down mines and things like that. We're talking about removing things like critical raw materials that exist in very few places. They've got a very high return, but the labour standards around that are very, very shady. So for example, we're talking about there, you know, the use of kids in mining is really prevalent in stuff like DRC. We're talking about kids who are mining cobalt, holding rocks with their bare hands and pouring sulfuric acid on to get the assets off. Like, these are huge human rights violations that are in our supply chains. And you've just said, you know, Steve, well, you know, investors won't stand for that. But we know, for example, that the big five sort of FAANG companies, you know, they're buying these materials from these mines. So, you know, we know at the moment, for example, Apple, just on as an example, is in the current, you know, UK Court of Human Rights for human rights violations in their supply chain. And it's not their direct supply chain themselves. It's not something they're doing. It's something they're subcontracting out to receive these materials. That's a very hard thing to quantify in a data center, but we have to understand that we benefit from the consumption, but the social cost is felt somewhere else. So we're looking very clearly saying we benefit from streaming, but it's actually the human cost in developing nations that are actually paying for this, whether it's, you know, the impact of e-waste on these societies, whether it's the impact of pulling out the mining on destabilizing political structures and governance. That is being felt globally for our benefit, and we don't get penalized at the moment for the impact we're having at that end of the chain. And I think that's a crucial piece that we're missing in data centers. We feel the benefit, we don't feel the pain.
Yeah,
there's no metric to measure it.
No, there isn't.
There's no metric, and that's right. And we're nearing the end of the allocation of time here, Rich. But that's super important because, you know, and you're thinking, I'm looking at the title of the webinar, thinking, you know, is the big bit of PUE, and you're talking about sustainability. Well, the point is that the big bit of PUE that we started with the IT. Yes, we can do a bunch of stuff with that. And yes, actually our PUE will probably get worse because we've got much more efficient IT. But the other side of this coin is that if we do address the big PUE, which is the IT hardware, then we're addressing sustainability goals as well. And when we're on that journey to addressing sustainability goals, as Steve was saying, we need to consider not just the IT when we're doing that, but also the facility, how we built it, what we used to build it, and what the supply chain was in that. And I suppose just in terms of wrapping up from all of us, you know, it's a cycle. You know, it doesn't, you might join, depends where you're joining, right? You're building the data center, you're going to join here. You know, if you're operating a data center, you're going to join here. If you're at the point of looking at life cycle replacement because your M&E or your IT's at an age where it needs to be considered, you're at a point. But it's, you know, it is continual improvement, and the route to get there is, you know, solid foundation of design and consultancy. And, you know, we hope that people will reach out to Keysource for that, and, you know, operating these facilities in a sustainable way. You know, tooling is key. We must deploy the right capture of data to be able to ever be able to socialize or report on what we're doing. And Rich, from your point of view, from a hardware services angle, you know, services out there to analyze existing operations and or future deployments, help with selections, help with replacement, and help with consolidation. And if everyone commits and keeps going, then, you know, we're on a route to improving our PUE, improving the efficiency of IT, and driving a more sustainable future for data centers. And, you know, in closing from me, it isn't a one-time thing. You have to get on. You have to get on the bandwagon. You have to keep going.
And Chris, just to add to that, you know, from the point of view of the services, you know, that need to be considered if you're going to lower the IT loads, and, you know, you've got facilities that are sitting there that aren't designed to operate at those low loads. So, you know, the original PUE metric perhaps does come back into it. You know, you need to consider that ongoing energy optimization of that facility to ensure that you're using your infrastructure in the best way possible, but also, you know, you must consider that you must undertake a life cycle analysis assessment throughout that as well, and that needs to be aligned with best practice and standards. And I think the closing point for me really there is, you know, all of these KPIs, a lot of the KPIs are in place, the metrics are in place, and a lot of the tool sets can be put in place to help you to measure those. That they're just not being used consistently, and we can help with that.
Thanks, Steve. And Rich, I'm going to leave the final comments to you. Give us a little nugget.
Look at your IT, improve it, then look at it again, and you'll be amazed at what you can do. Because the impact of that IT touches everyone in the world, whether directly or indirectly. And I think if you start thinking with a holistic worldview, you'll realize it's the right thing to do, not just for your business, but for the entirety of society.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I think we're about done here. So
we are. We have one question in the chat from Matt. So any tools available that we could offer colo clients to assess IT utilization? So if anyone would like to take that question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off here. Matt, good to hear from you. Yeah, I think there's, you know, to going back to in terms of capturing what's there. So we've got DCIM tools for operators and colo operators, which we can serve up to them. And the key point about that is understanding what the equipment is, because from an IT point of view, if we can understand what's there, then we can start to understand what the opportunity is. So we can deploy tools like DCIM to capture the assets, and then we can feed that into services and tool sets that Rich, you use to start spitting out what the opportunity could look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you know what it looks, once you know what you've got, you can understand where you can go. And that's the key thing there. Even as a colo, you can look at what the customers have got and then identify which are high performing, which are prime for replacement, which ones could be upgraded and extended. Even down to sort of our enterprise solutions, where you talk about shifting between sites and seeing what the carbon impact is based on the carbon intensity of that lift and shift. You know, that's the level of granularity that your customers are looking for right now. And you know, through partnerships like KeySource and Interact, you can deliver that in a way that no one else can.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the question. Good. Chloe, I think we're at wrap-up stage, are we not?
We are indeed, yeah. Thank you so much to everybody for jumping on. Thank you for your time. And yeah, we will have a recording of this. So if anyone does want the recording and slides, etc., then if you could drop one of us a note separately, we can send that through. And lots more to come from us on this pick. So thank you all. Thanks, Chris, Rich, and Steve.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for
your time today.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye now.